yesterday. That was
All right, we're back already. We
What?
just did a show a couple of weeks ago.
Wait a second. I'm in the
a
other
lot has
room,
happened.
Eric. Let me out of this room.
Hey,
Your back bedroom here.
oh, of course. I mean, if I can't find a guest, it's good to have a captive.
I'm a captive guest. You just slide the script under the door and we roll.
Exactly.
In
That's
fact,
where
the
we
paint,
roll.
I think the same paint in your room as it is in my room. Mine's a little lighter, but I think
Oh,
it's
that'd be funny.
the same paint job.
Yeah, and then we could hand each other things. Well,
Right.
in different
That would be
directions.
funny if we were right on the other side of each other.
Definitely. Okay, so we're continuing with our little subject we started last round. And you actually attended the parole hearing for this gentleman, Sirhan Sirhan.
Sirhan Sirhan. Yeah, that was odd. It was very surreal, Eric. I mean, I was representing Paul Schrade, who's 96, as a what they call like a victim's advocate, but it was merely a ruse to get into the parole hearing because Paul was there also. He actually spoke briefly at the end, but yeah, I've never done one of these before. It was quite shocking. The entire thing took like, I don't know, like 4.5 hours, man. It's like we broke at one point 11:30 till noon, but it started at like 8 o'clock in the morning.
Really?
Yeah, California time. I mean, I wasn't ready for that. I'm not ready for anything at 8 o'clock in the morning, but especially a parole hearing for a guy who was 0-15. I thought, how good can this go? He's 0-15. It's like the Orioles versus the Yankees. I mean, do the Orioles win every once in a while? Sure, but do you expect them to beat the Yankees? No.
So wait, I was thinking about that the other day. So he was arrested and essentially has been in prison or jail since 1969. So longer than I've been alive.
Right? Yeah. Longer than a lot of things. I mean, it's over 50 years in prison. I mean, imagine the technology and the things that have changed. Now, obviously, you can watch TV in there. I mean, he's been in, Folsom. He's been in San Quentin, and the past number of years, he's been in Raymond Donovan in San Diego. So he's seen the entire circuit. I don't think it has anything to do other than they just keep moving guys around all the time, to different prisons in California.
It's probably wise to break it up.
Yeah, I think it's part of their policy. Yeah.
People get too close. Now, you were going to walk us through the day. So you got there at 8 o'clock and you were a happy camper.
Not a happy camper, but, I got to suit up and show up for these things. So the first part, there's two commissioners. There's a male guy who's a commissioner, and then there's a deputy commissioner who is a woman. And the male commissioner and the deputy commissioner grilled him like he was a suspect in a murder. I mean, they asked him initially about his childhood in Palestine, and he had a complete breakdown immediately, sobbing incoherently, couldn't breathe. And I went, holy crap, they're going to have to get the paramedics in here, right? At 9 o'clock in the morning. He apparently suffers from PTSD from his trauma from his childhood of being in the middle of a war zone, having relatives blown to bits. And and when the commissioner started mentioning his early childhood trauma, he immediately went into, heavy breathing and sobbing. And the commissioner had to keep saying, breathe deeply, Sirhan, breathe, Sirhan. I went, holy Christ, what the hell? is going on here? We're a half hour into this thing, and the guy's having a complete breakdown. And he's been to 15 of these, so it's not like it was anything new to him. But something about the way the commissioner asked him the questions, he just had a breakdown, and it took a while to get him out of it. So that was dramatic, to say the least, at the beginning of the parole hearing.
So were you there? You were there in person and right near him, or how was it?
No. All of us were on Zoom, a closed Zoom loop that's invitation only. So there was like me, Douglas Kennedy, a prison advocate, Angela Berry, who was the lead attorney for Sirhan. And that's it. I mean, it was the two commissioners, me, Douglas Kennedy, the prison advocate, who was a sociologist, and then Paul Schrade and his advisor, Denise Bowden. Denise Bowden's father was a journalist who wrote a book on the girl in the polka dot dress. So she kind of grew up with the case. She's a lawyer who also made a couple of documentaries in the past. So she has been in the loop for a while. So she was with Paul at his house on Zoom or whatever this thing is called, in Microsoft Teams. And you can't record it or whatever. But the point of the matter is because of COVID, this is the way they do it now.
Okay, so now, how did you get called into this?
Well, I've been working with Paul for a number of years. I was filming him as part of a documentary about Paul Schrade. Now, just for the audience's sake, Paul Schrade is the last living victim of the assassination event. He was shot in the middle of the head, presumably by Sirhan. The first shot of Sirhan's goes into Paul Schrade's head, according to the experts. And he goes down, and since he was a close friend of Bobby Kennedy's. He was the West Coast regional director of the United Auto Workers out of Detroit. He was a union rep for the auto workers. He was also like a Democratic campaign operative working on Bobby Kennedy's campaign, and had been a close friend of the Kennedys going back, according to him, and the film footage that I have of him separately, going back into the early 1950s in Democratic circles as a union rep for the auto workers. He worked out here in the airline business as a union rep. So it wasn't auto out here. They were trying to organize the airlines, I believe. But that being said, since 1969 or 1970, he's been trying to get the case reopened. He has had all kinds of varied success he had one lawsuit where CBS was with him trying to get the case reopened. CBS News was on his side. That eventually led to the reopening of the ballistics. Yeah, here's Paul. He lives in Hollywood, 96 years old, very sharp, and has his wits about him with his little dog, and has worked tirelessly to have this case reopened. He also worked tirelessly to have the Ambassador Hotel turned into the Robert F. Kennedy High School, which has the Paul Schrade Library inside of it, where the ambassador used to stand on Wilshire Boulevard today.
Okay, one thing about his being shot in the head, I think you agree it probably was Sirhan's gun that did it.
Yeah, I don't think anybody disputes that. The shooting by Sirhan is quite wild, hitting 5 people all in a row in back of him, including William Wiesel and the other 4, the woman and Stroll and Ira Goldstein and Schrade. What's in dispute are the 2 bullet shots to the head of Robert Kennedy from point blank range according to Thomas Noguchi's autopsy.
Okay, and this is significant because literally the guy he shot in the head is one of the primary drivers trying to get him paroled.
Exactly. And in fact, he's been trying to get him parole for years. And in fact, he convinced Robert F. Kennedy Jr. A number of years ago that Sirhan should be paroled. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who had sent a letter of support in terms of wanting to have Sirhan paroled, is Robert Kennedy Jr. of the Children's Defense Fund. He, as an early advocate, has flipped lately from the Kennedy clan. Bobby Kennedy III was at the hearing. Who is his son, who's a film director who just did a film called Fear and Loathing in Aspen. Bobby Kennedy III was there, as was Douglas Kennedy. Here's Douglas Kennedy, yeah, who was very eloquent when he got to speak at the end, also supporting parole for Sirhan. Very, very smart man. And Bobby Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s letter was very eloquent as well. He had met with Sirhan in his cell or in a room at the prison and talked to him about the murder of his father and came away convinced that he didn't do it. The problem,
and that was a couple of years ago, right?
Only a couple of years ago, but he has stuck to his guns about Sirhan's innocence since then. And of course, because of that, has called for the parole of Sirhan. Angela Berry, the attorney, was the lead attorney and lead speaker on Sirhan's behalf. Now, in the parole hearing, Sirhan got grilled extensively about remorse, about his prison record, and how he's been doing in prison for 54 years. And I didn't know any of this. It was an education to me. Apparently, he got a degree in prison. He had a 4.0 grade point average. He's been attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings at their request. He's been a model prisoner. He actually had letters of recommendation from the prison guards, which the commissioner said he'd never seen ever in his career, recommendations and letters of commendation from the guards.
Wow, it's amazing. So yeah, if you could tell us about the procedure, because I mean, all we ever see is drama on TV.
Yeah,
and
I mean,
a small segment. You're already describing a full day.
The procedure is a full day, and the bulk of it, the first half of it, is them grilling him like he like the crime just happened. And they make him, talk about remorse. They made him talk about the crime. They made him talk about his life in prison. Some incident that occurred recently, a guy came up to him from behind who he didn't know, didn't see, didn't have a beef with, and slashed his throat with a razor, literally 2 years ago. And he had to be taken outside to a hospital. So not only is he an elder prisoner, which they now have different programs for early release of senior citizen prisoners, there's new laws that indicate that under the age of 26, if you commit a crime, you're considered a quasi-youth offender now mentally. And he was 24 at the time, and there's now on the books in California special considerations for not underage criminals, but criminals below the age of 26. And he fit that guideline as well. There's all these different guidelines for sentencing and parole. Not that they free you for that, but it's one of their considerations, quote unquote, and that goes into the hopper to consider parole. So not only did he figure into a 54-year sentence of absolute fantastic prison time of nothing on his record, he also fits the guidelines of an under 26-year-old inmate. He also fits the guidelines of an over 75, a guy in his mid 70s. The recidivism rate for someone released in the 70s is basically zero, was what the attorney contested, and the board agreed, at that point, that this was also a factor.
We don't know how long he's going to live.
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, this is not a 50-year-old man. I mean, the idea of him reoffending is, of course, absurd. He has no prison record. He has no criminal record. He can't recall. And here's the important thing with the commissioner, the lead commissioner, who had been a police officer, said in his testimony and his questioning that he had done hundreds of thousands of blood alcohol field sobriety tests on drunk drivers in his career. And he brought up the fact that Sirhan had multiple drinks that night. And this opened the door to my testimony, which nobody contested. In other words, the 15 times that he has lost in parole hearings is because they kept trying to relitigate the case in the parole hearings, which they strongly urge you not to do, because it's not a court of law. It's about your time. It's about how you're doing your time to get paroled. But what these people have done in the past is they've used Sirhan as a political opportunity to express and sell books and documentaries and talk about the case. And the parole board doesn't want to hear that. That's for the courts. If you reopen the case, which we're going to attempt to do by going to the DA once he's released, we're going to attempt to reopen the case. What they have tried to do on 15 occasions, previous attorneys, is to relitigate the case in a parole hearing, which is basically verboten. I mean, they tell you that this emphatically. So this particular parole hearing did not mention any conspiracy, any second gun, anything about hypnosis, anything about anything except him, the remorse that he had for the crime and the time that he served and how well that he served it, which is a textbook parole hearing. The parole hearing itself was a textbook parole hearing. And when the commissioner was talking about the fact that he was drunk, he extrapolated out when asking Sirhan, when he was trained as a cadet, how to use a gun, what was the main thing they told him? And Sirhan responded not to mix guns and alcohol. And he said, so you went to your car, you couldn't drive, you were drunk, you got your gun. Why did you get your gun if you were drunk? And he said, I don't know. He said, that's something I shouldn't have done based on my training. I never should have taken my gun from the car and brought it back into the hotel. So the guy said, where did you put it? And he said, I don't remember. He goes, well, did you put it in your pants waist? You put it in a pocket? He couldn't recall. And the commissioner then opened the door up to the fact that memory can be affected by alcohol. And in fact, that's what I believe happened. And that was my testimony, that he had a 0.16 blood alcohol level and he had shot people in a blackout. And what this parole board has seen over the decades is thousands of these cases where a guy in a blackout crashes his car into another family's car, kills them all. He's not interrogated to remember the moment of impact because he was in a blackout, Eric, from a blood alcohol level. So what has happened to Sirhan over the years, in my humble opinion, is they kept grilling him about remembering the actual shooting. And he says, I can't remember it, but that is quite common if you have a case with a blood alcohol level of 0.16. And you say, well, why 0.16, Mark? 0.08 is the legal level for drunk driving. 0.16 is double the legal level for alcohol in a DUI, double. And it's also the baseline for blackouts. Now, blackouts are essentially the inability for your short-term memory to transfer the memory to the long-term memory banks. That's what a blackout is. You can remember and do things. You can have sex with girls. You can drive a car and not remember any of it. You're not physically impaired. It's just the mental transfer of memory from the short-term memory banks to the long-term memory banks, which is called imbankment.
Many of us have had it.
Right, but I'm saying it occurs, as the judge, the commissioner pointed out, this was a small man who
He's like 5'4".
He's 5'2" or 5'3". He weighed about 110, 115 pounds. In other words, he was the size of a teenage girl, a woman. So, and he had a very low tolerance for alcohol. He didn't drink, so he had 4 gigantic Tom Collins in the span of 45 minutes. That's the reality of it.
Do we know why?
Because I do know why. Because it was an open bar. It was free. He went to the bar. There were all kinds of campaign parties going on. He wanted to pick up chicks, and he downed the 4 drinks. And he shot him down. He went to his car, and he couldn't drive. So he came back in. He said, I wanted to get some coffee. And the bartender said, I think this girl may know where there's some coffee. So who's the girl? It's the girl in the polka dot dress who takes him in the back to the silver urn and gives him the coffee, which is a separate part of the story, which I'll get to. But just in terms of the parole hearing, what I attempted to do was not go down the road of conspiracy. That's not what they want to hear. The goal is to get him out of jail. So he said, I simply can't remember the shooting. And what I was professing in which they bought into it because the commissioner said, he agreed with me, that this happened in a blackout. And like any other crime in a blackout, you're not responsible for actually remembering the point of impact when you run over an entire family and kill them.
Hold
You're
on.
responsible.
I have to answer this. I never said that I drove drunk, as we all do. Don't put those words in my mouth. I said that many of us have been blackout drunk before. That's completely different. And I definitely want to put that out there.
Okay. Well, he wasn't driving drunk either. In fact, he went to his car, realized he couldn't drive, and came back to the Ambassador bar area. There were three different political parties going on. There was one for Rafferty, who was a Republican. There was another one for another congressman who had won election, and there was the RFK party that was going on. Anyway, so the blood alcohol level at 0.16 is the baseline for a blackout. And that was my entire argument. And they seem to agree with that, that he's responsible for the crime. It doesn't get you off the crime. That's not a defense. It is a defense for not expressing remorse for the part you can't remember. So he has expressed remorse for the crime, for killing Kennedy, for the family, but he can't, and this has held him up for years. He can't express remorse for something he doesn't remember, and he said that. But they don't hold anyone else to this standard. They don't hold any other blackout killer, negligent homicide or intentional homicide, whatever. Nobody's been held to that standard, and the commissioner basically agreed. And he, had a perfect prison record. He admitted to the crime. He admitted coming out of the blackout with people strangling him and grabbing at him. And he remembers up until getting the coffee, which makes scientific sense, separate from conspiracy theories, separate from hypnosis, separate from, everything else, second gunman, all of which I believe myself. But it's separate from the legal parole that he's trying to achieve.
Also, the blackout drunk could be why he can't remember anything even under hypnosis, correct?
Oh, yeah. No, that's a scientific fact. Even under hypnosis in a blackout, in other words, the memory is not there for you to extract from being under hypnosis. They can hypnotize him all they want. The memory was never transferred from his short-term memory banks to the long-term memory banks. That's what a blackout is. I talked to Dr. Drew about it extensively the other day. We had a long conversation after the parole hearing, Drew and I, about this, and he agreed with me that, if it isn't, now keep in mind, he's arrested, taken to Ramparts to the station, where they take him into the breathalyzer room and take his blood and never release the results of that blood test. And you know why? Because there was a 0.16 blood alcohol count, and they sat on it for his case.
It's to be mitigating.
That's right. That's why they didn't release it. They took the blood, they took him into the breathalyzer room, which is standard operating procedure. They didn't do anything different with him. He was a John Doe at that point. And they took him in, and they took his blood. And, Marilyn Barrett, the attorney, has written about that years ago. So that's a pretty well-established fact. They did not do it because he was Sirhan. They didn't know who he was. So they did do it, and they kept it.
This is where we had Barnes here or somebody, because I have a feeling that if that did come out, it could have changed the charges against him.
Of course, you could have used the defense that I'm talking about. Now, I don't know if that's a successful defense, but getting into his trial, what happens in his trial, to segue into what we're supposed to talk about today. Oh, by the way, just on the parole hearing.
Yeah, I want to get the rest of it and hear what you talk about.
By the way. So about halfway through the parole hearing, a little bit more than halfway, all of a sudden I realized myself, I didn't say anything. I said, holy shit, they're going to parole him. And I just knew it. I could tell that this was the last hurrah by the state against this man. The way, how aggressive they were, how overbearing they were. I said to myself, holy shit, he's getting paroled. And I knew it. And in fact, at 11:30 a.m., after I testified, I was the last one to testify. I suggested that he be sent to a halfway house and be sent home eventually, but and to be sentenced to like 3 AA meetings a week. So the judge said, I agree with Mr. Groubert. I'm going to sentence him to one AA meeting a week because of his age. And I'm going to sentence him to 6 months in a transitional living, and then to the care of his brother, who lives in their original home in Pasadena that's now completely paid off. And his brother is alive, and he would go back to his original home in Pasadena. And that was the final adjudication by the parole board. The special circumstances that they added into it. You know, he could be deported back to Jordan, but it's highly doubtful, since he has no roots there and he's 76 years old, that would happen. I mean, he's not an American citizen. So in theory, he could be deported, but highly doubtful.
A few more details to clean up. One, just because he was recommended for parole doesn't mean he's out.
Right. No, that's absolutely true.
He has some very serious headwinds, because not all the Kennedys apparently agree with each other. And one, for example, Rory Kennedy, from what I understand, is fighting.
Right. Well, she was not alive when her father was killed. And I talked to Dr. Drew about grief this afternoon, about grief. And I said, can you grieve a dead relative who's been dead before you were born? And he said, no. In other words, it's hard. Bobby Kennedy was 14 at the time of his father's death, went to the funeral and experienced the entire thing. She was not born yet. So her claim that she's grieving the loss of her dead father is psychologically impossible, according to Dr. Drew, since you never met him and were not alive when he was dead. I mean, it's like grieving a dead grandfather from the Civil War. I mean, you know, it's you've never met the guy, you weren't even alive. But that being said, she's politically, socially trying to take down the parole situation, along with her brother. Is this Joseph?
Joseph, yes.
Right. Okay. So these people were not there. They have no idea what was said. They have no transcript, because the transcript hasn't been issued yet. They had every opportunity to show up and air their grievances. They refused to show up. Bobby Kennedy III was there. Douglas Kennedy was there. Robert Kennedy Jr. Put in his letter and everything. These people decided. Oh, he's right. I'm sorry. Dr. Drew is correct. He did say intergeneration transmission of trauma, which he believes in, but I don't. That's his thing. I don't believe that third generation Jews, descendants of the Holocaust, have trauma from their dead great grandfathers in the Holocaust, but Drew does. So we have a difference of opinion there. But I appreciate that. Thank you, Drew. The Joseph Kennedy was not there. However, they have made an organized effort to sabotage the parole. And their organized effort involves editorials and an organized campaign led by Rory Kennedy. So the question is, do we parole people based on a poll of the victim's family? In other words, if 6 Kennedys beat the other 5, 6-5 in an extra inning game, do we then not parole someone based on a head count of the family? Because they're now getting into grandchildren. They pulled out a grandchild today. A child of, I think, Joseph Kennedy has come out against it. So the question is, as a society, do we issue parole based on a head count of the victim's extended family, or do we do it as a parole board with the governor and let him look at the case and the details of the case, of which they're not privy to? The parole board, they're, as I said, they were not there. They didn't hear the testimony. I did, as did the other Kennedys who are in favor of parole. So that's, you know, that's one question. The second question is, which I pointed out to Paul the other day and multiple times, I'm writing an op-ed about it right now. These are socially progressive people who, in general, support the release of 76,000 criminals, felons by Governor Newsom, including 20,000 lifers who were hardcore violent offenders. They did not complain when Newsom, who is one of their political allies, released all these people. They did not complain when Gasson did not show up nor contest the parole for the first time in California history. The district attorney's office did not show up to contest the parole of Sirhan Sirhan. And that was a statement made by Gasson based on his progressive politics of which Rory Kennedy is a main supporter of, based on her work and her documentaries and her political allegiances. So apparently, what's good for thee is not good for me. There are families of the 20,000 who were released that Rory Kennedy could care less about, who also have dead relatives, and these people were released. She didn't speak out about that. But when you go to release someone who has had 54 years in jail with a perfect criminal record, all of a sudden this is an outrage against humanity. I mean, it's a little bit of hypocrisy, Eric, and that's what we're trying to point out. She doesn't know the case. She refuses to look at the evidence of the case, which is fine. But now she's involved in an organized campaign to keep this guy in jail the rest of his life, claiming that you live in Pasadena and can easily get to Malibu and kill her. I mean, this is crazy. This is somebody who's obviously vindictive. She was not alive when her father was killed. Her older brother, Bobby Kennedy Jr., is alive. He's for parole, as is Douglas, as is Bobby III, who is, obviously the grandson. But like I said, do we have to take a poll, a nationwide poll, or a Kennedy poll, or a poll to see who gets out of prison any longer? You know what I mean? Because he's like the last guy standing. I mean, Newsom has allowed 20,000 lifers to get out and 76,000 other felons. I mean, if not Sirhan, then who? If not now, when? I mean, look, I have no dog in the hunt for Sirhan. I don't even know the guy. But the facts of the case are the facts of the case. Simply because you're opposed to this guy getting out, you're using your political muscle to now, keep this one guy in prison while everybody else gets out. I mean, she made a documentary for HBO in 2001 called The Execution of Wanda Eugene, who was a black woman in Oklahoma. This is a documentary produced by Rory Kennedy. She made this documentary in 2001 for HBO. And this black woman killed her lover, went to prison for killing her lover in a jealous fit, did about 5 or 6 years, got out, and killed her next lover by shooting her and killing her in a fit. And she eventually went to the chair. But in the documentary, which is completely sympathetic towards this woman who was the killer in the documentary, the relatives of the victims, one of the relatives says, "How can you keep anger in your heart for all these years? I completely forgive her. Otherwise, I'd go insane." In her own documentary, a guy says this. And yet there is this incredible sympathetic portrait of a 2-time murderess who, exhausts every legal aspect of the system, including the Supreme Court. Jesse Jackson shows up, and she goes to the electric chair, to the gurney, rather, the needle. But apparently what's good in her documentary is not good in real life for this woman. Her social progressive politics are good for thee, but not for me, Eric.
No, I did want to ask this question earlier, but was there anybody there at the parole hearing against him?
No, there was no one there against him.
That's unusual.
The state, well, no, it is, because the state is, okay, there was a letter from a guy at LAPD. The sheriff's department didn't protest it. The district attorney's office represents the people, Eric. So the district attorney's office, in this case, Gasson, again, did not show up for the first time since the crime was committed, which was a political statement of the people. And this is outrageous to Rory Kennedy, that anybody who she supports, and she supports the politics of Gasson. She supports the policies of Newsom releasing 76,000 inmates. It's just the sheer outrage that the board would vote to release someone that killed her father, who didn't even do the killing anyway. The guy didn't do the killing, but that wasn't even a debate within the parole hearing. The debate was, even if you did do the killing, you have earned the right to parole.
Right.
And
did she give a reason or an interview anywhere as to why she wasn't there or Joseph wasn't there?
They had every opportunity.
It doesn't seem like travel's a concern.
No, absolutely not. She's in Malibu. She could have been on that Zoom thing protesting the thing, just, whatever she wanted. They're just taking the easy way out. They're just going to write an editorial after it's done saying, "How dare you do that? You could have aired your grievances. You could have come in there and said it," but they chose not to. They were asked repeatedly to do it. They could have written a letter. They wrote a letter at midnight the night before the parole hearing, trying to sandbag the other parts of the Kennedy family. They had a mutual understanding Bobby Kennedy was not going to show up if Rory didn't show up. So it was like to cancel each other out. So, right, Bobby Kennedy Jr. apparently didn't show up because his sister agreed not to show up, but they had threatened to show up, Eric, to answer your question. So instead, they wrote a letter saying they were opposed to parole.
Okay, I thought he might have been in court with maybe even Barnes.
That I don't know. That I don't know. But he wrote a very, very strong letter supporting parole, and that was read aloud by the commissioners. So, you know, that was interesting. But I mean, the fact that they're outraged and caught by surprise is meaningless. This is a 75-year-old man. I mean, if not him, who? I mean, what? Are you kidding me? You're traumatized by this, and you can't let this guy out. Do you think he's going to come to Malibu and kill you?
Now, as a fair comparison, he's not Manson. I guess I
Right.
wouldn't agree with parole for Manson, who
Right.
was old, but he was dangerous,
Okay.
could get people to do
Talking
things.
about
Yeah.
if you want to compare apples and oranges, I mean, Manson had a criminal record for 20 years.
Sure.
This guy has no criminal record before or after, right? He has
Mhm.
no violations in the prison. He has earned the commendations of the prison guards and every person who worked in the prison. I mean, this is a different animal here. I mean, if he can't get paroled in the current climate of prison reform, bail reform, sentence reduction, the reduction of mass incarceration, who else can get paroled? Who else? There is no crime on our books called political assassination. We do not have a crime on our books saying if you kill a Kennedy, you have to do life in prison. As the commissioner said, he was sentenced to life with parole, not life without parole. And I went, oh, right. Of course. I never thought of that.
Oh, he was sentenced to begin with. So it wasn't that his capital punishment penalty was overturned by the Supreme Court?
No, it was. I'm saying his capital punishment was overturned by the Supreme
Okay.
Court. And the resentencing was life with parole, not
Yes.
life without parole. They could have sentenced him to life without parole. They didn't do that. They sentenced him to life with parole. And the judge said, this is parole. This is where this is coming from. He
And
said,
he also is the longest serving current prisoner in the California system, right?
he's second. He's the number 2 guy.
Okay. I think Manson was one of them too.
There's a guy named Booker T. Something or other who's a little bit older than him, a black guy. So he's second.
Okay, now the part that I don't think people realize, and it surprised me, because again, I'll watch TV and I'll see, okay, I suggest he gets parole, boom, 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 everybody signs, he walks out in a few days or a couple days. No.
Right. It's a 90-day period where the 18-member board votes on parole, the 18-member board, which is scattered around the state. And what the commissioner said was that he's never been overruled by the board. The board usually votes with the vote of who's ever doing the parole hearing. At least that's what he said. So the same thing happened to the Manson girl who got paroled, and then it went to Newsom 3 years ago, and he declined to parole her. So I think the same thing is going to happen here. I think the parole board is going to vote to parole, the 18-member board, many of them handpicked by Newsom, of course. And it's going to be on Newsom's desk. Now, if Newsom's not there anymore,
I was going to say, well, if he's recalled, now it's Larry Elder.
Then it's Larry Elder's desk. So
we hope.
We don't know. I mean, it could go either way. But I mean, if Newsom has made statements about his love of Robert Kennedy, and who knows with Newsom. I mean, there's a letter that Bobby Kennedy Jr. sent to him the other day that I read, asking for physical time to meet with Newsom if he decides to not give him parole. Robert Kennedy wants us to go in as a group and try to convince him, which I'm quite willing to do, with Paul Schrade and Bobby Kennedy Jr. to make the argument if Newsom is just starting to decide not to do it. He asked him for, which he'll get. I doubt that Newsom's going to say no to a Kennedy, in terms of just meeting with him over this thing.
Problem is, Bobby Kennedy's kind of the bad Kennedy right now. He's, going against the narrative in his work. I'm not saying I'm against it. I'm just saying that
Right.
I would worry about that.
Well, keep in mind, there's also Kathleen Kennedy, who is the Lieutenant Governor of Maryland. She supports parole and a second gunman theory. There's Douglas Kennedy, who works for Fox News, who supports it. There's the young Bobby Kennedy III, who's a film director, married to a former CIA agent, as you're well aware, Eric. So there's a broad spectrum of Kennedy political wisdom here.
Okay, I don't dispute it. So, what would be the approach if you go in, though? Would it be the same as the parole, or then would
That's what I've been recommending. My
litigate?
recommendation has been to lay off of the conspiracy theories until he's out, and then try to. I said we'll go talk to the DA privately and try to get the case reopened. There's quite a bit of sympathy up there with the new district attorney's office for reopening cases involving bad cops. And that's why I mentioned to you about Manny Pena and Hank Hernandez, who are bad cops. And Gasson has a thing for bad cops. He's got an entire, that's Manny Pena, who was known as Manny Shoot 'em Up Pena. He was in charge of bank robbery division out in the valley, in the San Fernando Valley. He apparently shot 11 different suspects in the course of his career. Manny Pena was in charge.
Chauvin look like a prince.
What's that?
You make Chauvin look like.
Oh, yeah. No, he was called Manny Shoot 'em Up Pena, and Lieutenant, LAPD. Wow. He retires, quote unquote, and goes to Camp Peary near you once again in Virginia, and is trained as a CIA operative and sent to South America because he's Latino, speaks Spanish. And he goes separately with his buddy. This is Hank Hernandez, Sergeant Hank Hernandez, who was also trained by the CIA and was sent to South America to interrogate dictators using his lie detector machine. And
this is after Sirhan Sirhan?
Before Sirhan Sirhan. Both of these guys were CIA operatives out of LAPD intelligence unit. They were on loan to the CIA, separate missions, separate operations. Manny Pena leaves LAPD, as does Hank Hernandez. Hank Hernandez is sent to South America, where he is used by the CIA to interrogate various nefarious operators in the South American various countries down there. So when he's assassinated, when Bobby Kennedy is assassinated, both Manny Pena and Hank Hernandez are brought back to LAPD that month to run the investigation, which was completely bizarre. There were plenty of guys at LAPD who could have run this investigation, but they brought these two guys back. And these two guys ran the thing, stovepiping it, browbeating witnesses they didn't like, including Sandra Serrano, who we now have the audio tape still available of Hank Hernandez browbeating an 18-year-old Kennedy supporter named Sandra Serrano from East LA, who witnessed the woman in the polka dot dress running down the stairs, the back stairs of the ambassador, yelling, "We shot him, we shot him." And she said, "Who did you shoot?" And the woman in the polka dot dress responded, "We shot Senator Kennedy." That was the testimony to Sandra Van Oker from NBC News, moments after the shooting by Sandra Serrano that went national on NBC by veteran newscaster Sandra Van Oker. She had to be silenced. So she was taken in by Hank Hernandez and LAPD and given a lie detector test that went on for hours. And the lie detector test by Hank Hernandez is not really a lie detector test. What he does is he uses it as a weapon against her and others. He's done this for years, apparently, in Central and South America, and brags about it actually on the tape. That's how we know that he did this. He brags about doing this on the audio tapes, and he does it to her, and he wears her down repeatedly, saying, "You didn't see a woman in a dress. You're a liar. You have to recant for the love of Kennedy. Stop doing this." He becomes not only a good cop, he becomes a bad cop in the same testimony, in the same interrogation session. So the actual, EKG and the actual testimony doesn't really matter in terms of the lie detector. she is beaten down repeatedly by him until she is left in the room. She's left in the room with 8 polka dot dresses, and they look at her through a one-way mirror, and they tell her to pick out the dress that was the closest one to what the woman wore. And she starts looking at all of them. They're all variations on a theme. Apparently, it's a black polka dot on a white dress with a bib, is how multiple witnesses described it. She's not the only one who described the woman in the polka dot dress.
Right. We'll be going into more detail on that, and also getting the footage and sharing some of it. I'll probably need to pull highlights. I don't want to
of the audio.
Yeah, it's 8 minutes long, so definitely don't want to.
Oh no, absolutely.
But we can get the points of it. But yes, definitely.
So she eventually recants at the end of the tape, and they keep that as evidence, and they are systematically, the two guys, Pena and Hank Hernandez, systematically browbeating witnesses into not testifying or changing their testimony, which goes around at the time of the trial. Now, getting back to the trial, the reason I was mentioning the trial was they bring in a guy named Cooper, who is one of the attorneys. I don't know if you have a photo of Cooper and Parsons, the two lead attorneys. Cooper is I think the head of the California Bar Association, and he was the attorney for Johnny Roselli, the mobster, the previous case. And he had stolen a dossier off the desk of the prosecutor. And Johnny Roselli, the mobster, was on trial for a crooked card game in Beverly Hills at the Friars Club, where they had cut peepholes into the wall to see the cards of these wealthy Beverly Hills businessmen. And the lawyer was Cooper in this case. And Cooper admitted that he took the prosecution's documents off their desk at a lunch break. So Cooper had a sort of Damocles hanging over his head as Sirhan's attorney. And he didn't really want to contest anything in the trial. He merely agreed that Sirhan was the shooter, and he tried for a diminished capacity defense. The defense team was riddled with ex-LAPD guy. Michael McCowan was one, and Robert Kaiser was another. Robert Kaiser was a CIA media spook who wrote the original book, RFK Must Die. And Michael McGowan was a former fired LAPD corrupt cop. Both of these were considered investigators, and they were both leaking to the groups that put them into the defense team of the Sirhan defense team. So you had these 3 attorneys and these 2 compromised investigators, which was pretty typical. They did this with Manson too, I believe, according to what's his name's book, Chaos.
O'Neill.
Yeah, this was a technique that they did. They infiltrated. They used Paul Caruso as a lawyer to flip one of the Manson girls early on, and like the January 6th public defenders. Yeah, possibly. You know, who knows who these guys are?
Top demonstrators.
Right. So anyway, so they had a wire inside the case, and the trial was not successful. The diminished defense was not successful. He was sentenced to die in the gas chamber. And that's how he ended up when the Supreme Court later suspended the capital murder. He received life, as I said, with parole. And but the investigation itself was fascinating because of these 2 CIA guys going around LA stifling any conspiracy theories, quote unquote, about the case. I mean, you know, browbeating people, falsifying evidence. They used a different gun to test it. There were 2 bullets, which you can see right here. If you can go back wide a little bit to see these 2 bullets. On the right is the double candelore, and on the left is a single candelore. The double candelore was found in the stomach of William Wiesel, an ABC News executive who was shot in the stomach, and the single candelore was found in Kennedy's head. So it was 2 different bullets. Oh yeah, there they are. Yeah, the 2 and the 1 they don't really match is the point. And that one on the left, I think came not physically, but I mean the type used that was into Wiesel, and the one was shot in back of Kennedy's head, which leads us to Thomas Noguchi's autopsy, which I'd just like to discuss for 5 seconds. The autopsy itself that Noguchi carried out in the case was considered the most perfect autopsy in the history of coroners. And the reason it was considered the perfect autopsy was that Noguchi did not want another Dallas. So Noguchi called up Cyril Wecht in Pennsylvania, and he said, what do you recommend I do to make sure we don't have another Dallas situation for the autopsy? So this is Noguchi testifying at the Baxter Ward hearings, his coroner hearings in downtown LA in 1974, when Baxter Ward, the newsman, which is the center of my film script about Baxter Ward becoming a county supervisor to continue the investigation into the death of Robert Kennedy. This is Thomas Noguchi testifying. But the autopsy of Noguchi was considered a perfect autopsy by the LAPD, who said that it was a perfect autopsy. And the reason it's a perfect autopsy is because of the people involved in the autopsy. And I just want to read to you the people who signed off physically on this autopsy, from the actual autopsy right here that I have in my hands. Let me just tell you who oversaw this autopsy, because that's why it's considered a perfect autopsy. Thomas Noguchi, medical doctor, chief medical examiner, coroner; John Holloway, deputy medical examiner; Abraham Liu, deputy medical examiner in charge of neuropathology. The radiologist was R.L. Scanlon, chairman of the Department of Radiology at Good Samaritan Hospital in L.A. Henry Quino was the medical doctor, neurosurgeon in charge. Andler was the medical doctor. James Popham was a medical doctor. The pathologist from the hospital at Good Samaritan was present, again, as an observer to the autopsy. J.A. Kiernan was a medical MD. Consultants from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, Eric. This was Pierre Fink, Colonel, MC, USA, Chief Military Environmental Pathology Division and Chief of Wound Ballistics Division; Charles J. Stahl III, Commander, Marine Corps, U.S. Navy, Chief Forensic Pathology Branch and Assistant Chief Military Environmental Pathology Division; Kenneth Earl, Medical Doctor, Chief Neuropathology Branch; and then forensic and medical photographers: John E. Holloway, Deputy Medical Examiner; Richard Kotke, Deputy Coroner; Charles Collier, Scientific Investigation Division, LAPD. In charge of security for the autopsy room, Charles Maxwell, Chief of Investigation Division. Autopsy assistant was Edward Day, Senior Investigator. And then the advisors, the pathologist for microscopic studies was Victor Rosen, medical doctor, who was Deputy Medical Examiner. The advisors were William Eckert, MD, pathologist at St. Francis Hospital, Wichita, Kansas; Russell Fisher, MD, Chief Medical Examiner for the entire state of Maryland; Edward Johnson, Colonel.
People were in the room.
All of these people, I'm reading the names. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Bruce Smith, Captain.
Was it a theater? Like when they show on TV, you know, in the medical theater? I'm trying to figure out how they
dead body lying on a table, Eric.
I got that part.
Okay.
But,
and finally, Cyril Wecht, MD, Chief Forensic Pathologist, Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. The only reason I read those names was to indicate to you the level that Noguchi went to for this autopsy, this perfect autopsy. And the result of the autopsy was as follows. The bullets that killed Kennedy were fired at point blank range with the muzzle of the gun within 1 inch of his skin and back of his ear. 1 to 3 inches for the second shot, literally kissing his head for the first. Now, how do we know that? Because Noguchi took pigs' heads and pigs' ears and shot bullets into them for the powder burns to see the distance of the powder burns from the pigs' heads, pigs' ears, and measured it and compared the exact powder burns to those on Kennedy's head. So he matched that up with using a 22 revolver, almost the exact same gun, to see what the ashes and dust from the shots would match up in the skull. And what he came up with was a point blank range, or 1 inch. Now, Sirhan does not get within 3 feet of RFK because how do we know that? 70 witnesses tell us that. So the coroner's report is never discussed in the trial, is the reason I mention this. Noguchi is never asked the question that was needed to be asked, which is how close was the gun to Kennedy's head? And the reason
And why?
because it was a defense. It was not a defense involving ballistics is the reason.
Okay.
It was a diminished.
Somebody wrote a question in the chat, and it's a good question. I don't know.
Oh no, I agree. I completely agree, except that they used a different gun, and then just for their test firing, the LAPD used a different gun and said it was Sirhan's gun. They did not use Sirhan's gun. A gun they used was taken from another crime, another robbery, and the gun that they used was destroyed by LAPD after they quote unquote test fired it and said in court that this was the gun without any doubt that was used in the commission of the crime. That was a lie. They had a different serial number and then destroyed that gun, which gets us to the second gun, which was owned and possessed by Thane Eugene Caesar, the security guard, who most of us believe at this point was the gunman who actually killed RFK. Thane Eugene Caesar worked at Skunk Works in Burbank, where they designed the U-2 spy plane. He had top security clearance there. According to people who worked with him, he was able to go to any single spot in the plant with theory.
Better shots.
There's a shot of him. He said that he had worked at the Ambassador as a security guard on numerous nights. That was a lie. This was his first time being there for Ace Security. He claimed to have a 9-shot H&R 22, exactly the same as Sirhan's, only it was 9 shots instead of 8. And he, as most people would do, took his friends out in the woods based on his own testimony and fired as quickly as he could into a tree with the 9-shot revolver, asking them how many shots were fired. And he said none of them got the actual number correct. Why anybody would do that, of course, is absurd, but that's what he claimed to have done. He also claimed to have sold the 22 4 months before the assassination. He told LAPD that he had a 22 exactly like Sirhan's, and he sold it in February of that year. And the fact of the matter is that he sold it in September of that year, 3.5 months after the assassination. And why is that relative? Because Jim Yoder, the guy he sold it to, had a written receipt from Thane Eugene Caesar with a date. There's Jim Yoder with the receipt. He also worked in Burbank at Skunk Works. He retired and moved to Arkansas. And he bought the gun from Thane Eugene Caesar, and Thane Eugene Caesar apparently told him to be careful with the gun. It was used in a police incident. Okay. The date on here's the copy of the receipt. On this day,
I'm trying to keep up.
Excuse me?
Trying to keep up with you.
Oh yeah. Okay. So this is the receipt proving that he lied to LAPD, Thane Eugene Caesar, that he sold a gun 3 months to the day, actually, to Jim Yoder with the serial number. I mean, you couldn't ask for more evidence than this. So after he produces this evidence, oddly enough, his house is broken into in Arkansas, and the gun is stolen. But he still had the receipt, and there he is with the gun, and it's stolen, and it ends up being found years later in a swamp near his house. Apparently, that we believe LAPD immediately showed up and stole the gun literally 2 days later. Like they took a plane to Arkansas, rampaged through his house, and found the gun.
Wow.
That gun now exists, by the way. It's owned by a guy up in Sacramento who wants us to pay him $14,000 for that gun. So we're trying to somehow get the gun. It was dug out of the swamp. It was dug out of the swamp years later, and is now in the custody of a guy who lives in Sacramento.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah.
All right, so that wraps up part 2, because we're going to roll into, shall we say, the alternate narrative
Yeah, yeah,
of what
right,
you think happened
right.
for part 3
It's a
to wrap up.
two-part narrative because what happened, I mean, the parole thing is a separate legal challenge having nothing to do with what really happened. And
Mhm.
that may or may not be successful. But the second part of the third part of the series, which we'll do next, will be about the alternative history that we think really is the true history, to be honest with you. I mean, with Thane Eugene Caesar and the second gunman and hypnotism and, whoever was involved in this, there's a lot of shady things we have to get into at that point.
Oh, perfect. Till next time.
Till next time.
Everybody, if you want to catch the third part, you might want to subscribe.
Maybe.
Then you'll get an alert. It's going to be amazing. There are 3 CIA episodes with Mark. We also have Mark's initial interview. We have Mark with the illustrious Dr. Drew, who is in the chat. Thank you for showing up.
Thank you, Dr. Drew.
And many, many, many other people. So,
And hopefully we'll get Barnes at some point.
Hopefully.
Hopefully.
But, we'll hang out on our own anyway.
All right.